Welcome everyone to another discussion of In the Spirit of Things. Today I have with me Dr. Allan Wade, all the way from Canada, and it's like 5 o'clock there, I think. Dr. Wade's bio is in the preamble to this webinar telecast, so you can view that. I might just ask Allan if he would share a little bit of background with us on what he's done during his career.
Thanks, Kathy. It's really nice to be with you, and wow, chaplaincy. I had a look at your website and I looked at a few. It's very impressive. You've done a lot of really wonderful work, so I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you. I work primarily as a service provider, so a family therapist. My background is in family therapy initially, and fairly early on in my career, I started, for reasons unknown to me really, I started to become more and more specialized and interested in the problem of interpersonal violence, broadly defined. So racism, sexism, domestic and family violence, sexualized violence, child sexualized abuse, and so on and so forth. And I came to this interest largely through trying to come to terms with my own place in the colonial machinery, if I can put it that way. I was working a lot with Indigenous people in Canada, or starting to do more of that, and learning more about the history that I was very much a part of, but knew nothing about really. So I started to read my old high school history textbooks and university texts, and learned that I, like so many other people, had been quite blatantly lied to. And so that really began a process of working with other people, trying to understand the connections between colonial violence and domestic and family violence and sexualized violence, especially against Indigenous people. And so I was working as a therapist, seeing victims of armed robbery, gang beatings, various other forms of violence, and working with them as they prepared for court. I learned from the prosecution that some of the people I'd seen became quite good witnesses in court, which was interesting because we never talked about the court process. But I think what we did talk about was their responses and their history of resistance to the violence. And I think that kind of cleared the way for people to give a more confident and more factual description of what had happened in their cases. And I was then really fortunate to meet a number of colleagues and do a Ph.D. in social psychology, specializing in microanalysis. Microanalysis is a kind of a subfield of psychology where you try to break down social interactions into their very minute parts and look at the connection between hand gestures and vocal intonation and body posture and eye gaze and turn taking. And so when you apply that level of detail to instances of interpersonal violence, when it's appropriate to do so, you begin to see levels of detail that are not necessarily obvious. So that allowed us to see in a lot more detail, for example, how people would resist armed robberies. And that allowed us to ask better questions about how they managed to respond so carefully and prudently in the manner in which they did, even though they were terrified. So that led to a certain kind of way of working. And because we started to focus on resistance to violence as part of our way of talking with people, but at that point in time, there was very little in the therapy literature about that. Mostly victims of violence are portrayed as, passive or as affected or as impacted. So we began to really study the connection between violence and language with my colleague Linda Coates, and court documents, judges' reasons for sentencing, textbooks, psychological and psychiatric reports, and to look at how violence was obscured through the use of both ordinary language and professional language. So we've been combining those things and really trying to improve responses to violence in every institutional system. That's the big enchilada. That's what we're ultimately working for.
Wow, what an interesting area to be involved in. I guess these times that we're in at the moment would be, magnifying your years of work, looking at what's going on as a collective mass around humankind and violence. I was fortunate enough to be in one of your workshops when you were in Australia. And I remember, and I talk about it to everyone, wherever there's violence, this is the phrase that you use. And what we're seeing in the States and now echoing around the world is really that, isn't it?
Yeah. Individual resistance even by children who are being sexually assaulted and abused. A little 8-year-old boy, you know, wearing 3 pairs of pajamas when he went to bed at night. Refusing to eat what his abusive uncle made for him for dinner. Refusing to call him uncle. Refusing ever to have his photograph taken with his uncle. Very subtle, clandestine, incredibly spirited and prudent responses and forms of resistance. So we use the word resistance on that individual micro level, but also what we're seeing now, of course, this outpouring of resistance to colonial male supremacy and the widespread killings of Blacks, African Americans, and of course also the widespread killings of other racialized groups, and in Canada in particular, as in Australia, Indigenous people as well. So it's been incredibly inspiring to see this collective defiance of a state apparatus that's working hard to suppress dissent and maintain the old order, as it were. It's extraordinary to see the energy that people are bringing to it, the passion that people bring to it, the insatiable desire for dignity and justice, and how that is happening and catching on in large groups over many nations. It's extraordinary to see, isn't it?
Mm. Well, one of the things that I've wondered about is the re-traumatization of people participating and witnessing all of that, bringing up many different experiences throughout their life, particularly the injustice around circumstances.
Right.
Are there things that they can do, and are there things that those that haven't been through trauma, if anyone hasn't, to actually heal?
Well, I think one of the things that is extremely important is that people have the opportunity to sort of realize and talk about and express their own agency, their own viewpoint, their own worldview, not only their own suffering, but their own indignation. And so many people who have been subjected to violence have really never been given the opportunity to speak in the voice of resistance. And that's important on an individual level in the context of a therapy interview. It's important on the level of broad public discourse. And it's important on the collective level. So when people are able to experience themselves as engaged in active, prudent, determined, courageous opposition, no matter how clandestine that is, it can restore a sense of dignity. So violence, whatever else it is an affront to the dignity of the human being. It's a humiliation of dignity. And we can compound that humiliation by portraying the people who are harmed as passive or as dysfunctional. And there are many ways in which this is accomplished in our kind of industrial society, capitalist industrial white supremacist society. Part of it is psychiatric systems are used to do this. It's done through criminal codes. It's done in all kinds of institutional settings. So when people have a chance to rise up and experience themselves as collectively dissenting, I think a certain kind of healing can come from that experience. The other thing that's happening, I think that's very interesting, as you were pointing out to me earlier, is that what is coming directly under view or has been pushed more forcefully into view is the extraordinary problems with our public institutions in terms of how they respond to the problem of social injustice. It goes way beyond policing, you know? Yeah.
It's one of the things that I've been interested in, as you know, in the dialogue that's happening publicly. I mean, to move forward to for people does require a reevaluation of our public institutions, our policies,
right,
at every country's level. Um, and I'm just wondering, is that possible? You know, like, however, COVID does offer an opportunity to reevaluate everything. I spoke to a psychiatrist in New York, and she was telling me that she spends all day, every day, encouraging first responders to go out into the, you know, to do what they need to do, but to consider what they are doing for humanity on a more spiritual level. Because the policies and procedures that they're actually asked to follow are not going to help heal them. It's got to come from within. So I guess my question is it possible, I guess from a psychologist's perspective, you mightn't even be able to answer it, is it possible to re-evaluate the policies and procedures or whatever they might be that are harming people, to give an overall perspective and then to move forward? Because I haven't heard a single psychologist, or I've heard a few mental health professionals, but not anyone giving insight in this whole racial discussion during what's going on in the US at all.
Well, that's simultaneously hopeful and disturbing. So, yeah, it's concerning first responders. It's really important that you mention that. I mean, one of the things that we notice is that with many first responders who we do debriefings with, for example, I met with a couple of happened to be men a couple of weeks ago. They attended a horrible motor vehicle accident. One person happened to be at the scene, he wasn't on duty. The other person was on duty and then arrived. And they discovered they were both first responders, and they had a very quick interaction together at the scene trying to save lives. They were unable to do so. Then they wound up coming to critical incident debriefing, and I wound up speaking to them together deliberately because they had worked together. And one of the things we tried to focus on is how they communicated so carefully and so efficiently in such a short period of time. So that gave them the opportunity to talk about how they could see the other person knew what they were doing. And they had a common language, and they built up a certain level of trust with one another almost immediately. And then because one of the bodies was horribly injured and exposed as people were coming around, it was extraordinary the efforts they made to protect the dignity of the person who was dying by concealing their body, telling other people not to come too close to come into view. They were so mindful of the dignity of the people that were injured in every possible way. It was absolutely beautiful. And they hadn't had that conversation really before about how they take care of the dignity of people as they do this incredibly difficult work. So I think it's most fitting that so many people now, for example, in England, you know, staying on the balconies and clapping at 8 o'clock. But it's so appropriate now that we attempt to uphold the dignity of those first responders and acknowledge everything that they've been doing. So that's one level. The other is so many people who have been harmed by violence have had also, beyond the violence, negative institutional responses. They've had terrible experiences with people in positions of authority, whether that be police or judges or counselors or psychiatrists or school teachers, whoever it might be. And there's a lot of research that shows, as you may know, that the quality of those institutional responses from others actually better predicts the level of a person's distress than does the severity of the violence itself. That's extremely important for us to take account of. So there is a great deal of work going on to reform public institutions. In Canada, we have a tremendous discourse now opening up about not only police reform, but the reform of the way in which the government fails to police extractive industries, which work to extinguish Indigenous land rights in Canada. I know that in Australia, you just have had a horrible case of Rio Tinto, you know, it's blowing up a sacred Aboriginal site. If that was a Catholic church that they had blown up without permission, you know, people would go to jail. So this is coming into the view of the general public and being responded to in a very passionate way, and it's about time, and it's good to see. And I think I have some hope that we can achieve meaningful change. And I see more people in leadership positions in these institutions opening up to that.
Yeah, I mean, what you're really saying from that example about the first responders at the accident is that dignity is almost, or preserving dignity of someone is almost an innate response, because no one told them to do that. They just automatically knew that to respect this life, they needed to be protective. And if you reverse that, then you have the shame that some victims feel in other scenarios, such as child sexual abuse. They wear that shame because the response that when they start to adult or later as in adult life, when they're trying to be experience, the institutional response is inadequate. And that raises for me, it's all very well to reform these systems, but there are people working in these systems that operate in their square and don't want to move out of that square because they don't have authority or they don't. But it raises the issue around a bystander. What if they can't help? What should be their response to preserve someone's dignity? Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, it's often when you look in a very micro way, people are doing things that are not necessarily noticed, because so much of our social interaction with one another is so rapid and so subtle, we can't even really remember it 5 minutes later. So the original case, the Katie Genovese case, where the bystander effect was kind of created, that terminology was created. It turns out that Katie Genovese's brother, who went to war and became disabled through war injuries after, he made a film reviewing the events at the time. And his conclusion is that really nothing like the bystander effect took place, that people were more involved in trying to figure out the situation than was originally acknowledged. I've had that experience as well. I had a journalist call me not so long ago about an incident on a subway train in Toronto, Canada, where a man on the train, immediately after the train took off, started yelling and screaming and becoming very aggressive at people. And it was very dangerous. So I was talking to a woman, a journalist, who was on the next car to that one, but could see into it and could see the man, couldn't hear him, but could see him madly yelling and gesticulating, and could see the other people sort of sitting back. And her question was to me, let's talk about the bystander effect. So I just said, look, could I just ask you a little bit more about the situation? So when you looked into the next car, what were people doing? And she said, well, they were just sitting there, they froze. I said, well, hang on, as they were freezing, were they looking at each other? And she said, well, yeah, they were checking in with each other. They were all looking at each other. I said, right. And so did any one of them move? And she said, well, there was one young guy who sort of made a move toward the man who was yelling, but then a man beside him kind of held him back. And then I noticed the other people nodded at him, kind of like, yeah, thanks, that's what we need to do. And then what happened? And she said, well, there's a woman beside me in a wheelchair. I happened to be, she was in that area of the car. And she said, pull the cord to call for an emergency. Now, how did she tell you this? Well, she kept pointing up to the cord, and finally I pulled the cord. After you pulled the cord, what happened? She said, well, then the people in the other car kind of backed up, and they sort of looked at each other, and they seemed to relax a little bit because they could tell someone was coming. So once you started to look at the micro level, it was an instance of instant community. It wasn't a bystander effect. People coordinated very rapidly, very efficiently, and competently to manage the situation so that it didn't get worse. So many of these situations, there's a lot more subtle interaction going on to take care of one another than we might at first see.
So you're actually saying that the human doesn't necessarily stand back. It's like observing what's really going on before they actually mobilize or act, which is really what we saw with, the black killings in the States. There's people that were filming, if you've seen the full-length video, were horrified. And full marks to them for filming and being powerless to act in the ways that we think they could have acted. But by taking that video, they were able to show everybody else that so therefore we could mobilize and broadcast. And it has restored dignity to a lot of people to say, this happened to me too.
Exactly. And there were people that intervened at the time. There was Mr. Floyd's friend who had been in the car. He intervened and he tried to stop it. Another person came by and said, well, he can't breathe. Even one of the police officers said to the main perpetrator who had his knee on Mr. Floyd's, he said, well, shouldn't we turn him on his side? And other people were asking questions. So there were people trying to intervene, but you had 4 men with weapons standing there allowing it to happen. And that's a pretty powerful inducement that tells people you have to be really careful here. And of course they were right. What would have happened if someone had intervened and dragged that police officer off of Mr. Floyd?
Absolutely.
So these are situations in which there's no good choice. So people attempt to do what they possibly can to address the situation. But to see them wholly as bystanders, I think, is to miss some very important parts of what people actually try to do.
Yeah. We had a situation with a young Indigenous youth who would be 16, 17, and he was in a park, came from, it appears, I'm assuming, social housing landscape, and the police were patrolling the area. And from the footage I saw, the police were deliberately provoking. It's subject to an investigation, so I'm not, I can't comment what will happen there. But the young person lipped off, spoke some appalling language to the police, threatened the police, but he, in my view, was provoked. And then he was arrested, a leg sweep, flat on his back, a flat on his stomach, broke his teeth. I mean, it was violent. Yeah. And and as a result, somebody shared that on social media. It's gone, there's been a lot of discussion about this week. But the response from our authorities was really interesting. And it made me think about, us setting this topic around dignity. Some said the kid shouldn't have been lipping off, which is probably true. And I don't want any young man talking like that to our authorities. Others said it was an appalling exercise. I just wondered generally, as a community, is there any way that we can have, I'm talking about a checklist because human responses are so individual, but are there any ways that we can enter conversations where we are putting the dignity of the individual top of mind when we're passing comment, so that other people are educating ourselves as well?
Yeah, in order to do that, I think you have to have an explicit focus on the theme of dignity and what that actually means in your workplace, between fellow employees at particular levels, between management and employees at other levels, and between the workers in the organization, in this case, the police, and the public, the people whom they serve. How do you uphold the dignity of a person, a young man in a situation like that who is trying to be, who knows, smart or aggressive or what is it that you would hope for? You would hope that a police officer would think, well, I'm not in danger here, right? He's mouthing off, but nobody's in danger here. So maybe I'll try to have a conversation with him and say, hey, I'd really appreciate it, if you didn't yell and swear at me. If I've offended you in some way, I'd really like you to tell me. You would, now in a situation where someone draws a weapon, obviously that's not important. But, I'm just reminded of a story where police officers I knew in the north of Canada, where they were working in a very remote Indigenous community, and they were at a gathering, which was a healing gathering. There had been a rule that there was no drinking at this gathering from the community itself, not by the police. But the community had asked the police to come to just try to be around and provide safety, and because they wanted to try to change the relationship with police so that it would be better. And so this one man started drinking and getting out of control, and one of the elders gestured to a police officer, please come and intervene. So he did. He came over to the gentleman. He said, hey, Floyd, that's a bad choice of name, but hey, Robert, listen, there's no drinking at the gathering. How about you hop in my car and I'll take you back to your house? And Robert said, no, I'm not getting in your frickin' car. So he said, okay, I'll tell you what, how about I drive to your house by myself and I wait for you. And Robert said, okay. And he walked over to his house. And when he got to his house, he said, thank you, man. Now, that's dignified policing. He could have escalated, but he thought, what's going to allow this man to save face in this context? And if we're thinking about those things, and, you know, the same cop talking to him, you know, when he puts someone in the back of his car with cuffs on, before he gets in the front to drive away, he comes back and he checks, hey, are those cuffs too tight? Are you all right? Much of it is little things like that, that people can learn are important.
Can those things be taught?
Absolutely, people do them every day. In fact, we begin learning them in the first 48 hours of life, really.
Do we?
Yeah, there's tremendously interesting research on turn-taking between neonates and mothers. Mickey Rosenthal did a beautiful paper about this in 1982, I think, where she filmed in infants and neonates and mothers, and noticed that, of course, when the mother called, the baby would look around for the mother and then squawk. And when the baby would squawk and look around for a mother, then the mother was more likely to look at baby. When the baby talked, mother would talk. When mother talked, the baby would talk or squawk. And so they began a rudimentary turn-taking system within the first 48 hours. And some people argue that that's the beginning of moral action, because it involves reciprocity. It involves, when I call, you respond. When you call, I respond. I make room for you. You make room for me. So we learn how to do it from a very early age. In fact, we have to be taught not to do it.
Okay. I guess we would be remiss if we didn't talk about violence from women and children and other minority groups. This whole thing going on around the world at the moment, Rachel, has made me really wonder whether we will see a greater uprising around the Trump inauguration and the pussy hats and all that went on, because it is as though women and children are not being heard, and institutions are harming them. And for many women and children, they tried the route of saying, please help, please help, please help, and nothing changes.
Right. Yeah.
Do you think, reading public sentiment at the moment, do you see this as the beginning of many movements that will force change and that will force people to start considering some of the things around dignity, like mandatory training in workplaces? I mean, we're terribly appropriate around dignity and inclusion. Are we really getting the message? It's really my question.
Yeah, if you look at the curriculums of the professional groups that respond in cases of violence, so school teachers, 35% of children who probably, depending on the jurisdiction, experience violence as they transit the school system. Medical doctors who make a lot of diagnoses in various countries of mental health problems. Psychiatrists who, you know, begin as medical doctors, psychologists, social workers, etc. If you begin to look at the training curriculums that they receive in school, how much training do you think they get on understanding interpersonal violence?
I don't know.
Very, very little, almost none. I talked to a group of Ph.D. psychologists last week, 12 of them, Ph.D.s in psychology, and I asked them, how much training have you had specifically on interpersonal violence, the different forms of violence, how they're functionally linked, how they're connected to structures of power and privilege, how they're connected to political economy, how one form of violence enables another, how people respond to and resist violence, etc. To what extent have they had any courses like this? And the answer was none. We had one textbook. And yet we all know that the single best predictor of whether or not a child will one day get a diagnosis of having a mental disorder is whether or not they experience violence in childhood. So really it is like we have created a medical school with no courses in cancer or diabetes. Who makes these decisions that young child protection workers should come out of school with very little training in interpersonal violence when 85 to 90% of the cases they're going to be involved in involve violence? So it just makes no sense whatsoever. So that's one place we really have to think very critically about the way we educate people who become involved in the professions. But at the same time, some of what we're seeing here is that women's organizations, who in many places are funded on a shoestring and have to constantly fight for refunding year after year after year, rather than receiving base funding, for example, are having to be incredibly creative to find new ways to create safety. Pop-up shelters, different kinds of phone trees, different ways of making connections in a private way, because COVID, for many people, unfortunately, has increased conditions that are favorable to people who use violence. Social isolation, the lack of social contacts, the lack of contacts with just moving about an outward society where people might notice. So the preoccupation of police and others with other kinds of social problems. So there have been rapid increases, huge increases in levels of violence against women and children over this time period, including increases in murder rates.
Do you, I mean, the other group that I'm observing is our youth, our young people. And the commonality, certainly in our chaplaincy discussions, is that there are many, many young people who are feeling as though their world, what they're going to inherit. Why? Why am I going to go and work for the next 30 years? Why am I going to do all of this? It's totally screwed up. It's as though we need a United Nations around healing people, because we don't know the ramifications of COVID yet, do we? We don't know the proportion of populations that are going to suffer post-traumatic stress disorder and all of these things. We certainly have an indication of first responders, particularly in populations where it's been massive, like Italy and the United States and Brazil. I guess to end our conversation, which is really what we all want to hear, what can we do as humanity to try and save ourselves, to try and restore dignity, to try and help each other? Because it is about joining together.
It absolutely is. I think it's about ending violence. It's about promoting a socially just world. And as fanciful as that sounds, and the fact that it sounds fanciful is actually the problem, isn't it? So I think we have to get a lot better at addressing all forms of inequality and promoting justice across all of the interfaces where people are involved. So in order to do that, you have to look really baldly and directly at what violence is and how it works. Who perpetrates violence? Who's harmed? How do people respond and resist? What do our people who lead our public institutions need to know about how to respond appropriately? So that will have to involve, in my view, for example, changes to our criminal codes, just to pick one avenue, because our criminal code in Canada transforms violence against children into sex with children. So does your criminal code in Australia. So these crimes are talked about as though they're sexual in nature. So at the same time, we're funneling incredible rates of violent pornography into the lives of boys, into the lives of all children. And we know that it's harmful. The average age at which boys in North America begin viewing porn is 11 and a half. And we know that viewing that kind of violent material is associated with sexism and attitudes that are supportive of sexualized violence. I see boys at 12 and 13 who have raped their younger sisters after viewing porn. So the government of Canada has thrown up its hands as though this is some sort of normal psychodevelopmental, this is how sexuality is developed. And of course it's not. So you may have noticed that at the beginning of COVID, you may have heard the story where there were people trapped on cruise ships. And one of the US-based porn companies decided it would be good marketing to offer people free porn, free access to their website. Because they said, at a time like this, people really need to have more human contact. So what we're doing is portraying profound humiliation of the human spirit, profound humiliation mostly of women. What we're doing is portraying that as sexual contact. So we need to be a lot better at understanding the distinction between violence and sex, for one thing, making sure that that is reflected in all of our public institutions. So those are some of the things I think that we can be doing. There are initiatives underway to do this. There's wonderful organizations like Talita in Stockholm, who has been helping women escape human trafficking. There's a great organization in Sydney, as you know, called Domestic Violence Services Management, who we've been working with, and they've really been working with us to sort of develop materials, educational materials. Your own Kate Alexander, who's with the Office of Senior Practitioner Child Protection. I think that organization has been doing really innovative work and upholding dignity under the banner of dignity-driven practice. We're seeing meaningful changes so that people who experience violence will have the opportunity to speak about their responses and their resistance and have that acknowledged, and have their already existing capacity and desire for justice at the center of the picture.
Yeah, I was privileged to sit in one of your workshops, and the issue of pornography came up, and I think I was the one that asked the question. Okay. And the reason I'm raising it is because, you can say, oh, it's public institutions and those that sit in policy, it's their role to correct this.
Yeah.
But when you talk about pornography and who funds pornography, which is the credit cards and its banks, and it individuals applies everybody in any way. Okay, who are
absolutely there's no way in which an 11-year-old child, an 11-and-a-half-year-old boy will understand the nature of the material, the context behind it, the incredible exploitation of the people in the images, primarily women, the economy behind it. And they're told that this is what men want. So they're watching oral gagging at age 12, and they're being told that this is what men want. And they're incredibly confused by this, understandably. And it is in my opinion, and the opinion of many others, it is a very serious international form of child abuse that masquerades under the banner of sexuality. For our governments to fail to take decisive action to protect our children is one of the most profoundly harmful abrogations of their responsibilities than I can think of. Mm-hmm. So why not start by boycotting all hotels in Australia that provide adult content in hotel rooms?
That's a very good suggestion. And that's somebody who works in that area saying, well, we can think outside the box. We can create movements individually. We can do something.
Yeah, of course we can. Yeah.
Thank you, Alan. I could talk to you all day, as we can tell we've gone over time. For anyone watching this, Alan will be talking later in the year at CX Banks, which is an online gathering. I'm sure we'll go a lot deeper into this subject then. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you so much, Kathy. I really appreciate being with you. Thank you very much.